Hello and welcome to another Earnestly Eston book chat. Today let's spend a few minutes with Farewell, My Lovely by Raymond Chandler. This book was originally published back in 1940 and I read this vintage book edition that I bought off the used market. But Farewell, My Lovely by Raymond Chandler is the second of the Raymond Chandler novels that I've read. I read a while back The Big Sleep, and I did chat that, so I will link to the chat down in the details below. So The Big Sleep was the first of the Philip Marlowe detective stories by Raymond Chandler, and this one is the second. So hard-boiled detective fiction. I just love this sort of classic hard-boiled detective fiction from this era. Many of them are adapted into films. This one's no exception. It's been adapted into films at least a couple of times. The one from the 1940s is from 1944, and it is titled Murder, My Sweet. And I believe it starred Dick Powell and Claire Trevor. Definitely worth a watch if you're interested and you come across it. I will be just dealing with the book here in this chat, however. Farewell, My Lovely. Yeah, so I want to be really careful. This is kind of like a detective story, mystery thriller kind of thing. So I don't want to give anything away during this chat that would detract a first-time reader from a pleasant experience with this book, so I'll be real careful about that. But just a bit about what it's about. So it all starts with a woman named Velma. So Philip Marlowe, this takes place in around the same time it's written, I guess around 1940, in Los Angeles. And Philip Marlowe, the main character, the detective, is out and about in L.A., and he comes across this kind of big, burly, kind of unusual fella whose name is Moose. And he comes across him like at the entrance of this sort of nightclub. Well, he gets drug into this club, even though this club is primarily for African Americans at the time. Again, this is 1940, so but he cannot stop this guy from wanting to go into this bar, because this guy is looking for someone who used to work there. This woman named Velma. It turns out Moose has just been released from prison, and he is now out trying to find Velma, and he will hear nothing else other than, even though Philip tries to tell him no one in there is going to know Velma, because the bar has changed over the last, I think it's been 6 years or something. Well, it winds up he does go up there anyway, and through whatever happens, there ends up being a murder. And so the way Philip Marlowe sort of gets drawn into this murder is because I think I took away from it, because the victim was an African American, it gets assigned to a policeman who's really overworked and doesn't have a lot of time to put into it. So sort of as a favor, Philip Marlowe, who is a private detective, starts looking for this guy, Moose, because he took off, after the murder, and starts following the trail of this mysterious, woman, Velma. So that's sort of where we start the story, and then we wind up. Winds up getting mixed up with a jewel heist and possibly a jewel theft ring. A mysterious psychic. There's a offshore gambling racket that he bumps up against at one point. There's a corrupt town, because you know how LA is this really collection of cities, right? Not just Los Angeles proper, but the metropolitan area of the city itself. There's lots of jurisdictions, and so one of these that Philip gets involved with is got a corrupt mayor and some crooked cops as well. Philip Marlowe winds up getting involved in with this shady doctor and a drug ring, and it just almost this tour of the seedy underside of 1940 Los Angeles, basically. He meets some interesting characters along the way. One of them that I was going to mention is Anne Reardon, because I think she was really one of the kind of more interesting of the other characters in the novel. Anne Reardon, he sort of meets by happenstance in kind of a, I won't give away the circumstances he meets her. It's just, she sort of pops out of the blue at really the right time for the story. And so at first I was like thinking, yeah, that was real convenient that she just happened to show up there. But then I realized as the story went on, this was sort of her personality. She has a lot of nervous energy, so she roams around a lot. I think she's a woman really, I took away from it anyway, sort of like trapped in that era, where she was capable of being a detective herself, and actually wanted to be, but because of maybe the circumstances, she couldn't exactly maybe pursue that course like hopefully she would be able to do today. Her father had actually been the police chief in the corrupt town that I talked about, the town that is now corrupt but hasn't always been corrupt. We'll talk more a bit about the different types of police that are illustrated in this book here in a bit. So, I mentioned about the LA of this era. So this is one of the reasons why I really enjoy reading this type of book, is because it's this sort of hard-boiled detective fiction with all the slang and sort of references of the era, and so it really has a really good feel for that era to me. I really like the film noir and films from that era, so I sort of dig the era in general anyway. And I feel like the best way to actually immerse yourself in that is to read and to go into these stories that were actually written during the time. And there's a lot of references in here, that we really wouldn't get today. The slang is a little bit different. There's some derogatory slang around African Americans and other minorities that is used. Some of it I had never actually heard before, so it's from that era. There's some of that, because again, we're dealing with sort of the seedy underside and just sort of the cadence of the dialogue. So if you've ever watched one of these movies from like the 40s, you know what I'm talking about here. And the book is kind of filled with this dialogue. I'm going to read a quote here in a bit from Philip Marlowe that's going to really illustrate that language really well. So I talked a bit about the police, different ways that the police are illustrated in the book. So, we really took this away from the book as well. So there's different kinds of police, and there's the kind of the incompetent police, or really the overworked kind of like police that's not really that smart. The detective in the police department that's not really that smart. That's who Philip sort of gets involved with really early on. And then there's different levels of corruption. There's some really smart cops. He comes across a really smart cop. He comes across a corrupt cop, and he himself, I believe, is an ex-cop, or I can't remember now exactly. He does talk about his past. He has at some point been involved with law enforcement in some capacity, though. But that's sort of illustrated to me, like the different, like we think of people in that role that they all should really be smart and really know what they're doing, but just they're not always necessarily like that. So the police, the law enforcement's very like uneven. Some are like heavy-handed, violent, and others aren't so much, really rely more on their intellectual skills. So I thought that was sort of an interesting sort of thing to uncover during the course of the book. There's this other character. I mentioned Anne Reardon, and how she's actually one of the good people. So there's different types of people, also different types of cops and different types of people illustrated in the books, where not everyone is all good, right? And so this one thing about this kind of stories from this era, this hard-boiled stories, is that really what it's showing us is that there's really good and bad to different degrees in almost everyone. So not everybody's really bad, truly bad, although some are in this book, and some are just sort of a mixed bag, and most people are actually this sort of mixed bag. Anne Reardon, though, is really good, and he meets another person who's actually a genuinely good person that helps him actually with the gambling ring that I talked about. And this guy, he says, is like probably one of the nicest guys he's ever met, and so coming from Philip Marlowe, okay, well, this is a really nice guy, because Philip Marlowe's got this really cynical view of humanity where he actually sees sees everybody's flaws and forgives a lot of them as long as they're not harming him in particular or anyone else that he's around. He's kind of a hero, but not really a hero. He's kind of an anti-hero. That's I think that was true also in The Big Sleep, where there's not very many people who are actually really good. I think Anne Reardon, though, even though she was pretty hard, she's pretty hard-boiled herself, and we don't get to know her maybe as much as I would have liked. So there may be more there to her. So I mentioned about the references of the time. One of them that I had to kind of look up was he talks about we need an MRA, like the pop culture references, the cultural references of the era. He's talking about I tried to find it again. I couldn't find it. I didn't bookmark it, so I'm not sure exactly where it was. But it was either he says we need a Moral Recovery Act or a Moral Rearmament Act. And I think that's referencing, he calls it an MRA. And so when I looked up NRA, because this is what I thought it was referring to, the National Recovery Act, the NRA, was the government program that was put in place to kind of recover from the Depression. And he makes a point there in this sort of reference to the sort of play on words with an MRA as opposed to an NRA. MRA, Moral Rearmament Act. That we need that, in the country. Someone needs to do that as opposed to just focusing on the economic recovery. He's talking about a moral recovery. So I thought that was really kind of cool. So finally, before I run out of time, I want to read this quote. This quote is by Philip Marlowe. It's actually, he finds himself in this corrupt private hospital. And he's had a really, really rough time, you'll tell here. But this really illustrates the language and the way the book is written. So here, Philip Marlowe is actually talking to himself because he's very weak from everything that's happened to him. And he's trying to talk some strength into himself to get himself up out of bed and dressed. And he says, "Okay, Marlowe," I said between my teeth, "you're a tough guy. 6 feet of Iron Man. 190 pounds stripped and with your face washed. Hard muscles and no glass jaw. You can take it. You've been sat down twice, had your throat choked and beaten half silly on the jaw with a gun barrel. You've been shot full of hop and kept under it until you're as crazy as 2 waltzing mice. And what does that amount to? Routine. Now let's see you do something really tough, like putting your pants on." So he's been beaten, he's been shot full of hop, he's been given drugs, and he's been kept unconscious till he's as crazy as 2 waltzing mice. I think that's so funny. I also think it's funny when it says, 190 pounds stripped and with your face washed. That's sort of the language that I'm talking about. That's sort of the dialogue that's Raymond Chandler so known for. So much fun. All right, I'm going to close the chat with that. I will be reading some more Raymond Chandler and also Dashiell Hammett. I have some more of that in my reading future planned. This sort of hard-boiled detective stories from this era. But my next chat is going to be Of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maughm. So that chat should be coming up fairly soon. Until next time, take care. Bye.